Ancient Rome is often portrayed in modern media as a utopian society where law and order prevailed. Everything from their aqueducts to their roads is praised by many to this day. However, that picture-perfect image of ancient Rome is tarnished when we look into the darker aspects of life during that time. Things like the gladiator games, the treatment of slaves and women, and their public latrines are definitely not things that we associate with paradise. But the Romans did have one other very disturbing habit. They buried people alive. While this may seem absolutely crazy, especially considering that the idea is still considered taboo even today, it was actually fairly common in ancient Rome. It's also more closely linked to their concept of justice than you might think. So stay tuned as we look into why exactly the Romans liked burying people alive so much. To start off, let's get a little bit familiar with what the death penalty entailed in ancient Rome. As most of us know, there were a few ways that a person could meet their demise. You could be put to death by lethal injection, the electric chair, hanging, or any number of other ways. And while all of these are certainly brutal, none can compare to the slow and agonizing death that awaited those buried alive. But before we jump into the nitty-gritty details of this, if you're enjoying this video, please make sure to hit that like button so you don't miss any of our future uploads. In ancient Rome, the punishment of being buried alive was handed down for a number of different crimes. It was usually reserved for the worst offenders, such as those who committed particularly gruesome murders, or for those who showed nothing but contempt for Roman law and authority. It was even used for treason, an offense that could be applied to just about anything from criticizing the emperor to actively plotting against him. Suffice to say, it was quite easy for a person to find themselves buried alive in ancient Rome. But the sentence itself was not always a death sentence. Sometimes a wealthy person could bribe their way out of an underground grave, only having to spend a slightly uncomfortable night or two underground until they were eventually dug up the following morning. That wasn't always the case, however. In fact, most of the time, the sentenced person was given every possible means to ensure that they would die in their tomb. This meant that the walls were made of concrete instead of the more forgiving stone. Their food and water were removed to prevent starvation and dehydration, which might sound cruel, but was actually seen as merciful. This was because the main point of the punishment was to make the offender suffer mentally rather than physically. The idea was that watching your own demise and being completely helpless to stop it would drive a person insane. And if that wasn't enough, the guards sometimes threw in poisonous snakes or other animals to further unnerve the condemned. You might be wondering just how long this torture would last, and that's where things get really gruesome. Most sources agree that after the food and water were removed, the condemned were left alone in their tomb for anywhere between 12 and 36 hours. After that amount of time, they would usually pass away from either starvation or dehydration, but there was no guarantee that the end would come quickly. In fact, some people apparently survived for longer than expected, leading to a number of rather creative solutions to speed up the process. One of the most reliable methods for ending the lives of those buried alive was simply to wait until nighttime and then cover the opening of the tomb with dirt, suffocating the poor soul inside. This practice was actually so common that there was even a word for it: expoliadosis. One of the greatest differences between this form of capital punishment and others is that this was typically carried out in public. It was almost always done in full view of friends, family, and members of the community. In fact, the whole ordeal was sometimes turned into a spectacle. It's much like the gladiator games. And people would bet on whether or not the condemned would live or die within a certain amount of time. This part of Roman culture seems a bit odd to us today. I mean, gladiators and chariot races were popular forms of entertainment. But why would anyone want to watch a man slowly die in front of them? Well, there are a couple of reasons for this. First, keep in mind that the Romans didn't really have movies or TV shows to entertain themselves, so they had to get their thrills from real-life events. Secondly, the whole point of this type of public execution was to deter people from committing crimes. By showing the horrible fate that awaited them, the Romans hoped that others would be less likely to break the law. It's kind of like the old saying goes, an eye for an eye. All that being said, however, this form of capital punishment wasn't exclusively used by the Romans. Ancient Greek and Egyptian cultures also saw the use of being buried alive as a form of punishment. And even in World War II, there was at least one documented case of Allied soldiers doing the same to captured Nazis. Perhaps the most famous case of a person being buried alive, however, happened in 1971 in New York City. David Berkowitz went on a shooting spree and managed to evade the police for several months. Eventually, he was caught and pleaded guilty to 8 charges of murder. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive jail terms of 20 years each, along with 3 consecutive jail terms of 10 years each for the attempted murders. So yeah, I'd say that one can safely argue that being buried alive is any of the worst thing that can happen to a person. But perhaps what's even more shocking than the punishment itself is how it was carried out. When people think of ancient Rome, they usually imagine a bustling marketplace, the Colosseum, and maybe even the Trevi Fountain. But did you know that ancient Rome was also a hub for vice and debauchery? In fact, when the sun went down, it was a completely different world.